This is Dr. Rich Schuttler with lesson number 9, Survey Instruments, in the program Taking the B out of ABD. All these lessons are in Chapter 3, the Methodology chapter. In this lesson, I'll address an introduction. I'll discuss and give some insights about reliability and validity and how to allude to those inside your Chapter 3. I'll then discuss quantitative and qualitative information on your survey instruments and how to perhaps best address those areas in Chapter 3. Then I'll share several examples of prior mentees of mine, and I'll conclude with a reflective summary. This lesson is designed specifically to help you better understand what content to put in Chapter 3. It's beyond the scope of this lesson for me to be able to share enough information with you to teach you about creating survey instruments and how to actually test for validity and reliability. But what this program is really more so about is helping you to better understand what kind of content you need to have in your chapter so that when you develop these sections before writing Chapter 3, you'll know exactly what to include and what level of details. The first item I'll address is reliability. I like to think of reliability as dependability. For example, you go out to your automobile. You have a certain reliability factor because you depend on it that it's going to start. It started every day so far for the last couple of years. You expect that when you go out there it's going to start again. It's a certain amount of dependability based on the type of car you have, what kind of equipment is in there, perhaps the type of battery, how long that battery has been in your car. And it helps you to have a sense of comfort, if you will. The same is true of research with reliability. It helps everybody to understand that there's some dependability in the fact that what you have can be replicated or can be repeated elsewhere. For example, if you're doing a study in a hospital and it happens to be in Denver, Colorado, if you have a reliable instrument, therefore it's dependable, you should be able to take that same survey and apply it at a hospital in California within a certain amount of reason, because the hospital in California is the same type of hospital that's in Colorado. What we're able to see, if you have the same type of population, that you should be able to use the same instrument. This is not 100% true, but the idea helps ground the fact that if you have a survey instrument, whether it be a Likert type survey or open-ended questions that you're going to do through interviews, that it can be repeated elsewhere with similar type survey populations. The questions that you have, they're precise enough that they would be able to be used in other locations, meaning that they're not overly generic. That if it's about a hospital emergency room and you're doing a case study about how people act or react based on how they're trained, in most cases those same questions should be able to be applicable regardless of what emergency room you go to. Much of this comes into play whether you decide you're going to use an instrument that's already been used by somebody else or you're creating your own. If you decide that you are going to write your own questions, you want to make sure that you're going to be able to test it to make sure that your questions are precise enough that they're going to be reliable beyond the use for just that one application. This is where we find the value of a pilot test. A pilot test is that pilot study which allows you to take your questions and apply it to a very small population that's equivalent to your survey population and have them test it to be able to give you information whether the questions make sense or not. For example, if you're doing a quantitative correlation type of research study, then you would take your survey instrument and give it to a certain amount of people and have them go through the survey to determine if they can in fact understand all the questions. I learned in one of my research studies that I had questions that had some American slang in it. And when I did a pilot test with certain people who had English as their second language, they didn't understand the slang terms. And therefore, I learned from the pilot test. And from that pilot, I then decided to reword some of the questions so that was more generic, if you will, in this case, to be understood by anybody, regardless of whether English was their first language or not. Also, this comes into play when you're doing a qualitative study. Perhaps you're going to do a phenomenological study and you're going to do interviews asking for people's assumptions or their perceptions. You create the question in such a way that you believe to be true, that it's going to work well for you in your study, but then you give it to 3 or maybe 5 people who are qualified to be in your survey population, and they look at it and they look at the questions and they determine whether you have worded the questions in such a way to provide the type of data or answers you're looking for. The pilot study or the pilot test can help increase reliability. There's a separate lesson on the pilot study and the pilot test that's part of this chapter's program in a prior lesson. The next area I'll address is validity. When I think about validity, I look about how it is in regards to reality. Reality meaning that sometimes there's a difference between theory and practice. The validity often means if you're going to do a questionnaire that you're going to ask people, perhaps in a case study, where you're relying a lot on the information that's based in the body of knowledge. Theory is one thing. We know that oftentimes practice is something completely different. We want to be able to test whether our questions have a certain level of reality to them and they align, if you will, with theory, but also allow us to be able to get examples from what's really going on. This is oftentimes where the value of triangulation comes in, because if you're going to do interview questions, you can base them in the theory, and then you can triangulate that findings with other people later to see to what extent or to what degree that the people gave the answers are to be true or aligning with that theory. When we see triangulation, we're looking for 3 data points. In my example, when I did my dissertation, I included triangulation because I was doing a mixed method study. In the survey I actually sent to over 800 people, there were 12 Likert type questions to ask quantitative questions. Then I had 3 open-ended questions, which were the qualitative. Once I was able to get all the data put together and information generated from those 2, then I went back into the survey population of people who completed the surveys and interviewed 5% of the people who responded with their questionnaires back to me when they completed their survey. I asked them if they agreed or disagreed with the information that I was able to get from the data I had. In 90% of the cases, everybody did agree. And what this allowed me to do is have an extra level of comfort that what I did had a certain perspective of reality to it and helped increase the validity of my study. With qualitative instruments, the survey instruments, they're going to be, in most cases, questionnaires. They're going to be open-ended questions, or they're going to be closed-ended questions. You have to decide what's best for your study. An open-ended question may mean that you have an open-ended question and it allows people to then provide their own answers based on their own unique lived experiences, perhaps their own individual assumptions or beliefs or perceptions, or maybe you're asking something about the values, or if it's a case study, perhaps you're asking about explanations. And so they're open-ended in the fact that you ask the question and you're not sure exactly what you're going to get. A closed-ended question often means that it's a question and it may have a certain amount of detractors that they have to give you. Or perhaps it's as such where they answer the question and you're not allowed to ask follow-on questions. A closed-ended question is often much like a question that has people picking one of several detractors from it, not necessarily to what extent or to what degree, but it's a closed-end question where you are asking them to give an answer and pick one of the choices. Then there's the interview types, where in a qualitative instrument, as you ask the questions, you're going to have to decide whether you're going to have structured or semi-structured interviews. The structured interview means that you're going to have it set and everybody's going to get the same questions the same way. Everybody's going to get follow-up questions or not get follow-up questions. Semi-structured interviews means that depending on the answers that a certain person gives, you may ask follow-on questions, but you're not sure what they are, and you may not ask the same follow-up questions to everybody. There's a difference between open and closed-end questions, structured or semi-structured interviews. As you write to your instrument in Chapter 3, you have to decide which one or which ones you're using and explain why. Remember, in Chapter 3, it's about excruciating details. as you're writing Chapter 3, when you're referring to how you're going to collect data through your survey instrument, let's say perhaps it's your questionnaire, you have to explain, and it may be in a paragraph where you discuss open and close-ended questions and structured and semi-structured interview techniques, and that may be all you need. But you do have to have this in Chapter 3. Not only have to share what it is you're going to do, but how and why. In qualitative instruments, you want to ground each question in the literature, not just because you want to ask certain questions. All questions should be born from something that you can relate to. If you happen to have 8 open-ended interview questions that you're going to ask in a phenomenological study, there should be some rationale, reasoning why each question was created and why you're asking it. The problem I see in many instances in early drafts of proposals, particularly when they put their interview questions together, they don't indicate how each question was created. Remember, in Chapter 2, when you did a synthesis of all your literature, then you did an analysis and evaluation of that synthesis. From there, you should have found some sort of gap in the body of knowledge to which your dissertation is more than likely is related to. Ideally, the questions you're going to be asking are related to that literature, suggest there's some problem out there or there's a gap in that literature. Perhaps some of your questions on the interviews are going to relate to what you specifically wrote about in your problem statement. There's many ways to show how each individual interview question was born. You just have to make sure that you do it. There's many different ways to do that. Again, it's beyond the scope of this lesson, but what's important to know is that when you're writing this section in Chapter 3 is that you go down to the excruciating details, so there's no doubt about why you're asking questions. If you happen to decide that you want to ask a question or two that's not necessarily related to your study, well, then you might want to indicate that in your work. For example, when I did my research, the company who allowed me to do my research in their organization asked me to include 3 questions on their behalf, since I was going to be interviewing people. It had nothing to do with my research, and I included it in my study, and I wrote it in Chapter 3 that these questions did not have anything to do with my study, but they were requested on behalf of the company who gave me consent to do my study. So when people read my dissertation, they'll see that there's 3 questions there that have nothing to do with my study, nor did I analyze any of the data in my dissertation. I did that separately and gave it to the company. But because those questions were on the survey that each person got, I needed to address it. The qualitative instruments really are asking questions depending on what it is you're looking for. For example, if you're doing a phenomenological study, you're looking for lived experiences. You want to make sure that your questions that you're going to be asking in the interviews are written as such, where you're going to be able to ask their lived experience, which perhaps are their assumptions, whether their beliefs, or whether their perceptions about what the situation is that you're asking them questions about. Perhaps if you're doing a case study, there you may be asking several different people who have some knowledge of a situation to ask for explanations. And this is more so they're explaining what happened. They're explaining a process. This could be perhaps if you're doing a case study in an emergency room at a hospital. Let's just say there was an example of a trauma situation. And once the trauma situation was over with, you wanted to do a case study to see how all the stakeholders worked with one another, to see to what extent or how well they were able to perform based on the training that the hospital gave them. So in this case, you'd be asking perhaps nurses, doctors, staff people, ambulance drivers, everybody that had anything to do with that trauma situation, ask them to explain the processes they went through, ask them to explain what they believe they saw, what could be done better. So these are more so explanation types of questions, and they're going to be written a little bit differently than if you're looking for lived experiences. And of course, there's going to be other types of questions that you will write depending on what your research design is. In the qualitative instruments, perhaps a concept map to show relationships or interrelationships of the questions will be helpful for you. In Chapter 2, I have a lesson about concept maps. You may want to review that, but the idea being is that if you can create a concept map based on the items that you want to find out about in your research, then you can take these concepts through a map and then show the relationships or interrelationships that will help you better describe how each interview question was born. You may even want to include this concept map as a figure in Chapter 3. If you go through the effort of creating that concept map, there's nothing wrong with sharing it, and I encourage you to share that, because as in any chapter, a good figure or a table can add value to your work. It'll help the reader be able to see quickly the relationships or interrelationships and help them to understand how each of your interview questions were born or where they came from. In the qualitative instruments area, the pilot study interview questions. You want to allude to how you're going to do your pilot study. You don't have to go to every level of depth here about exactly what's going to happen, because you've done that before when early part of this chapter when you wrote about the pilot study. But here again, when you talk about your instrument, you're going to say that you are going to do the pilot test, and perhaps that you're actually going to do more than one pilot test if in fact you get feedback from the population who are in that pilot study that suggests major changes have to happen. Now, if you address this already in the pilot study earlier in this chapter, you may not need to do it again. This is determinant upon your dissertation chair and your university guidelines, but it's not uncommon in Chapter 3 to have an early part or an early section in the chapter that deals solely with the pilot study. Then when you're writing about the survey instruments themselves, you allude to it again that a pilot study will be done and the reason for it to help ensure the reliability and validity of your study. Basically, what we're looking for with the qualitative instruments that you need to write about is to fully explain how the questions came to be. This is a question you can ask yourself once you look at your own work, and ask yourself as you read it, have you fully explained how the questions came to be? If you have 8 open-ended, semi-structured, planned interviews, can you fully explain how each of the 8 questions were born? What was the tie back to the literature? What was the tie back perhaps to the body of knowledge that suggested there was a gap in the body of knowledge, or to the problem statement that you had created early on in Chapter 1? And then make sure that you have accurately reflected how you're going to test for those questions being accurate, meaning that they're going to be valid and reliable. It's important to go to that level of detail. Remember, Chapter 3 is all about details. We want to know exactly how each interview question came to be, why you're asking it, and where that information was gained from that allowed you to write the question. Oftentimes, somebody else may want to do a study much like you're doing, and they may not know exactly how you came up with your 8 questions, and they may not see the tie-ins that you have, and that oftentimes is the value of your work as compared to somebody else's, or the fact that you may be creating some new knowledge because you've seen and have found a relationship or an interrelationship that nobody else has perceived before. Now we'll talk a little bit about quantitative instruments. These are often referred to as Likert type surveys. There's no such thing as a Likert survey. It's a Likert type survey. Likert was a gentleman who created these types of surveys, and the most appropriate way to refer to it is a Likert type survey. Again, in your Chapter 3, you're going to have to explain how the questions came to be, just as you would have done in the qualitative section. If you're doing a mixed method study, you're going to have to do both. Right, for the quantitative and the qualitative questions. You're going to have to, again, reflect how each question was grounded in the literature or where it was born from. In the case of my survey, which is called the Supervisor Leadership and Communication Inventory, there's information you'll see in a few moments. I'll share an example of what's written, and the fact that the questions were grounded in the models with the stoplight metaphor that I created in the laws of communication. In a quantitative instruments, creating your own survey. You have choices. You can either create your own survey or use somebody else's, and I'll address both of them. First off, I believe that if you want to create your own survey instrument, you should, whether it be qualitative or quantitative. Now, I do realize that some faculty members or dissertation chairs and universities discourage you from doing that, because it can be quite a lengthy process. I don't believe it to be true. If you're guided by somebody who understands how to create questions and then how to test them for reliability and validity and do end item analysis, then it's not that hard. I did it, and I'm certain that you can do it as well. But if you are going to create your own, you are going to reflect how you did that and why. You're going to have to reflect, of course, how you tested each question. This is no different than before. But the point here being that if you create your own survey instrument, that's going to be a Likert type survey, you're going to have to justify everything, just like you would otherwise. So it's nothing new. But if you end up with a questionnaire that has 70 questions, well, sure, that could take some time. I don't encourage you to start with 72 questions right off the bat, but perhaps you might do something like I did, where I had 12 Likert type questions in my dissertation survey that I created myself. Here's an example of a passage. It says the supervisor leadership and communication inventories items were initially generated based on red, yellow, and green behaviors modeled by Schuttler 2008 in press. At that time the book was not published yet, it was in press. It's since been published. The first draft of the instrument named the Supervisor Communication Inventory contained 71 Likert scale questions. She gave a source here. Later on, we were able to refine that Supervisor Communication Inventory to become the Supervisor Leadership and Communication Inventory with about 52 questions. So you can see from this passage, if you were to write something similar on a survey instrument on how it came to be, you would basically give information such as you see here. If you want information, you can go to www.nrc-slci.com and look under methodology. You'll find how Dr. Rouse and I related to our instrument, how it came to be, how it was tested for reliability and validity. This example may help you. You can also go to any dissertation in ProQuest Dissertations database, look at your university's dissertations that are published, look for your research method and design and see how other people have done it as well. And of course, read any research reports where people create their own survey. Now, if you're going to use somebody else's survey, you have to reflect how it is appropriate for the data you need. You're going to have to do this with every question anyway. You're going to have to support how each question is going to support the data you need to have. One way to do this is to be able to take every question and tie it to how that data, once it's analyzed, can help you to either reject the null or fail to reject the null hypothesis. Because when you either reject or fail to reject the null, you then answer your research question. So therefore, if you have all your Likert type survey questions aligned to independent variable, you'll be able to see that you'll have the connection on how each question was born or where it was born from. If you're going to use somebody else's quantitative survey, you're going to have to get their permission. And it's not enough just to get an email from them. You need their written permission. You need to get permission from them indicating that you can use their survey instrument. Keep in mind, some authors will charge you. If you wanted to use the Myers-Briggs or the LPI, Leadership Practices Inventory, you're going to have to pay for each one. If you want to use others, perhaps like mine, the Supervised Leadership and Communication Inventory, you still need to get permission from me that's signed, but I do not charge. What I require is that when your data collection is done, that you'll send the file, an Excel file with all your data for each question, and that you will also then provide a copy of your dissertation when it's published. The data I will use and combine it with all the other data I have for each question to help increase the statistical testing for each end item analysis. And then I want to be able to see how you use my work at the end, but I don't charge for that. It depends on whose survey instrument you want to use and whether they're going to charge you or not. You should only use somebody else's survey if, in fact, the data it's going to produce is going to be data that you need for your study. All too often, people want to study one thing, and they say they want to use somebody's survey instrument, and it doesn't necessarily provide the data for what they need exactly. Maybe it has 70% of the information. Well, then what do? Does that mean you're going to augment it with your own questions? You certainly can, So it depends on what you're going to do, but the important point here is that as you're writing chapter 3, you're going to have to write that if you are using somebody else's instrument, of course, how it's going to produce the data you need to be able to answer your research questions, and that you have written permission. This written permission is not only that you have to show it, but in chapter 3 you would also indicate what appendix that is found, because once the person signs it and dates it, then you'll take a copy of it and you'll scan it and you'll put it as an appendix in your proposal and later dissertation. In the quantitative instruments, have to reflect how reliability and validity were tested. Now again, it's beyond the scope of this lesson to teach you that, but you will have already had research courses, and when you write chapter 3, remember, you have to indicate how that came to be. I will show you several examples how some of my mentees have done it in their chapters, and I'm sure, as I mentioned before, you'll find many other people who wrote it just as well in their published dissertations. With the quantitative instrument, you're going to have to decide how many you're going to include and why you're going to include so many in a pilot test. Some may say, well, if you're using a survey instrument, perhaps you're using mine, the Supervisor's Leadership and Communication Inventory. It's already been used. It's already been tested. Why do you need to do a pilot study? This is a point where, again, you may get different answers from different people. As a dissertation chair, I require all my students to run a pilot test, regardless of whether an instrument was tested for reliability and validity. I do this because, in part, the dissertation is still a learning vehicle. It's much like an assignment, if you will, for earning one's degree, and I believe a student should be able to know how to do a pilot test. Also, a pilot test may produce some information that was unheard of before. Perhaps if you're using it with a new type of survey population that has some unique characteristics, perhaps of demographics or understanding of the questions, you may find that some people don't understand every question, or that they don't have the skill or wherewithal to answer the questions correctly because maybe they don't have a certain level of education or experience that was perceived when the survey instrument was written. Regardless of why you do it, you want to indicate how many are going to be in your pilot test and why that many. Now there's formulas that you can use to determine how many you have to have, but you also need to include the rationale for the pilot test. Why are you doing the pilot test? Why do you have so many in it? What's the rationale for that pilot test? Again, chapter 3 is about the details. Tell us about the pilot test for your quantitative instrument. Now I'll share some examples from some of my mentees. All these examples that I'm going to provide are from my own mentees, and they were approved on the first run through of their proposal and dissertation. This is because they paid attention to details and they truly did outstanding work. Each of my mentees whose work you're going to see has given me written consent. I have permission to use their work. They maintain the copyright. I just cut and pasted from their work and include it here as part of their brain tithing as well to share their insights with you. You're welcome to go to ProQuest Dissertations, put in their names and download their dissertations if you care to read the whole document. I encourage you to do so. If you find it of value, I also encourage you to email them and let them know the value you found in their work. The first example I'll share is from Dr. Patricia Schroeder. Her dissertation was published in 2013, titled A Quantitative Correlation Study of Individualism, Collectivism, and Employee Innovation in Turkey. In her chapter 3, she wrote, "The instruments have demonstrated a history of reliability and validity when used with Hofstede's guidelines in survey administration." If you're not sure about survey administration from a quantitative perspective, you might want to take a look at Hofstede's work. What she's doing here is helping educate the reader, helping the reader to understand that she knows what she's doing. Again, she's given the rationale here. She wrote, "The SLCI," she used my Supervisor Leadership and Communication Inventory, contains 53 Likert scale questions that have been used to measure the correlation between supervisor communication and employee performance. The research study included the 15 questions that assess leadership practices. Out of the 53 questions, she only used 15 of them. This is fine. You don't have to use every question in everybody's survey unless they say you cannot use only certain sections of them. She requested to only use the 15, and she was given permission to take only those 15. She continued to write, the SLCI has been tested for reliability and validity with strong results. If you wanted to see what those strong results were, or you wanted to see how it was tested, you could go to Rouse 2009, of course this is in the references, and find out how she did this. Now Dr. Rouse is my research partner and she produced that information. You do not have to, in your chapter, indicate everything, but all you have to do in this case is indicate that it has been tested. If somebody wants to read more and learn more about the SLCI, they can go to the source and find it out for themselves. She continued on in her work saying the ability to draw inferences from survey data is dependent upon the validity and reliability of an instrument, and she cites Creswell, which is appropriate for quantitative work. Crook et al. 2010 indicated the reliability of an instrument is derived from the consistency in scores from a scheme of measurement, where validity is evidenced in the measure that is an accurate depiction of the construct being tested. Here, again, she is helping the reader to understand that she knows what she's talking about and giving evidence of that here in this writing. She continued on with, the SLCI has undergone rigorous testing, validity, and reliability. Again, she cites Rouse 2009. The instrument was tested by subject matter experts for content validity. The content validity was demonstrated using Lachey's minimum value of 0.42. Using Cronbach's alpha, the SLCI's reliability has been tested, with a strong reliability demonstrated in Cronbach's alpha 0.98. Again, she shares exactly how the instrument was tested, and you can see here how it's been done. Now, Dr. Joseph Hagee in 2013, in his quantitative study, which is titled Influence of Religion and Religiosity on Leadership Practices in the Workplace, which is a quantitative correlation study, offered this. Koises and Poisoners created the Leadership Practices Inventory, which is known as the LPI, to measure the actions and key behaviors of people when they are leading. Poisner 2010 reported internal reliability coefficients on the LPI self ranging from 0.68. Again, you can start to see the information here, and if you want to find more, you can go into Poisner 2010. He indicated also here, as shown in Appendix D, John Wiley and Sons granted permission to use the LPI survey. Appendix D would have that survey request that was made to the publishing company, John Wiley and Sons, that was signed that he could use that LPI. Same as it would have been in Dr. Schroeder's. If I include that there was also a passage that said in what appendix was the permission to use the SLCI. Dr. Hagee continued in his work and indicated surveys about religion, religiosity, and religious behaviors may be unreliable because participants often respond to questions in terms of what they should be doing and not in terms of their current behavior, and gave a citation there from Krauss et al. 2007. The URPI includes 5 questions intended to form a lie scale and are coded as such that you see here. What he's helping to inform the reader is that he realizes that sometimes people do not tell the truth, particularly when it comes to religion in this case, because sometimes you ask people what they're doing, it may be different than what the belief provides for them. Dr. Hagee went on saying respondents who had an aggregate score exceeding 20, greater than 80% on the 5-lie scale questions were removed from the analysis. In such cases, those disqualified participants were replaced by other randomly selected ones. What he's helping you to understand here is that if he believed people were not truthful, that he removed them because those questions he had provided before gave him the evidence to be able to do that. Now, Dr. Kristeniak in 2011, in her dissertation, which is exploring the experiences of complementary therapy nurses, a qualitative phenomenological study, will have a different perspective because her study is qualitative. Instrumentation can be described with this methodology to include both the interviewer and the mechanisms to collect data, audio taping and transcribed interviews as the data source. The interviewer acted as a guide to secure the essence of the lived experiences of the nurses interviewed. What we're seeing here, she talks about lived experiences, which we would expect to happen in a phenomenological study. We start to see alignment everywhere in these people's work based on their research method and design and word choices that they use. The methodology of the proposed study as developed by Heidegger proposed the construct that one's very existence in the world cannot be separated from the development that occurs in the human act process. This reflective process was required during the test evaluation. What we're happen to see here is that Dr. Krysteniak again is educating the reader to help the reader believe and gain a sense that she knew what she was doing when she put her dissertation together. Dr. Krysteniak went on to write, reliability is determined as dependability or consistency that can be repeated under identical or similar conditions. Newman 2006, she cited. To improve reliability, Newman suggested having clearly conceptualized constructs, use a precise level of measurements, use multiple indicators, and use pilot testing. Remember, I talked about pilot testing earlier. I also talked about how you can start to look at reliability as dependability. What she's doing here, again, is showing the reader that she knows what she's doing and has given rationale for what she did. She continued on and said, validity suggests truthfulness and describes how well an idea is aligned with actual reality. Validity is a bridge between a construct and a data. Qualitative research seeks authenticity over validity. Authenticity is described as providing an honest and balanced account of social life from the viewpoint of one who is living it. And she cites Newman. Remember, this was a phenomenological study, so she's talking about lived experiences, and she helps us to understand that there's a difference between validity and authenticity in a qualitative study. In this chapter, I want to continue to remind you that this chapter is much about showing your discerning knowledge of research. As I indicated before, you have to be somewhat of a subject matter expert in your research method and design. Often I tell my mentees is once chapter 2 is written or have a good draft of chapter 2 to stop reading in the content for what's related to the body of knowledge of the study and start reading more about research method and designs, particularly the one that they're going to use, because this will help them become more of a subject matter expert, and all of a sudden chapter 3 is enriched with deeper content and rigor based on the research that they cite from other experts. The end result, chapter 3 informs others of your choices and rationale for your choices. The rationale for your choices. Keep that in mind every time you write a section in chapter 3. You're going to explain what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, and why you're going to do it. That why you're going to do it gives the rationale. If all goes well, somebody should be able to pick up your chapter 3 once it's approved and do the study the exact same way you would have done it, step by step, and knowing exactly why you would have done what you would have done. And what kind of details are we looking for in this chapter? Yep, we're looking for excruciating details. As far as a reflective summary, I gave you a brief introduction to this lesson. The idea was to help to give you more information on reliability and validity and some examples from quantitative and qualitative information that you need to have within your chapter explained. Again, it's beyond the scope of this lesson to teach you about all these different things. You've already had research classes on that, or you will get research classes. If you need to learn more, I encourage you to consider hiring a research tutor. I can recommend Dr. Ruby Rouse as one because she's the one who tutors me on a regular basis. She's an expert in quantitative studies. She does all that work for me. I'm very good with qualitative work. She's an expert in quantitative work. So if you need to create your own survey, you need to do end item analysis, you want to test for reliability and validity, and you need help, she's perfect for that. I'm sure you can find other people as well in your local research departments at large universities, perhaps people who will mentor you for a minimum amount of money, or you could barter with them perhaps and share something you have and help them out as well. I also shared some examples from my prior mentees. Again, if you found value in any of the passages I shared, please go back to that lesson slide there, look at their name and their dissertation name. You can go into ProQuest Dissertations online and download them and read the entire chapter if you care to. I do believe that education is a lot like life, much like I do believe your proposal and dissertation is the same, that the more you put into it, the more you're going to get out of it. And the more you put into it, chances are people are going to get more out of it in the long run as well. I'm Dr. Rich Shuttler. I want to thank you for being with this lesson today, part of Taking the B Out of ABD program.